Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar on U.S. foreign policy in the post-Trump era. I'm Pablo Pinto. I'm the director of the Center for Public Policy at the Harvard School of Public Affairs. And this event is co-hosted by the Center for International and Comparative Studies that's headed by Professors Zachary Zwald, who will be speaking shortly. We have a great lineup of panelists, Professor Tyson Chatagnier, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Houston, who's an expert in economic and security relations, Professor Ryan Kennedy, who's an associate professor and Senator Don Henderson Chair in the Department of Political Science at UH, whose expertise is in energy and environmental affairs. Dr. Ashley Leeds, who's professor and chair of the Department of Political Science at Rice University, an expert on international institutions and military alliances and the role of leadership change on foreign affairs. Nikolai Marinov, who's a professor of political science at the University of Houston, an expert on human rights and sanctions. Professor Patrick Shea, also from the University of Houston, and whose research lies at the intersection of security and economic relations. And it's a great pleasure to have you all here. We're very interested in understanding changes and continuity in foreign policy affairs. It's like after the Trump administration. I'm going to open up by yielding to my colleague Zach Zwald, who will talk briefly about the genesis of this webinar and the main drivers and ideas of what should we expect to change and what we expect to continue in terms of foreign policy in the U.S. after the transition to the Biden administration. I yield to you, Zach.
Okay, thanks, Pablo. So today, the title for the panel is U.S. Foreign Policy in the Post-Trump Era, Opportunities and Limitations. So in that title lies the impetus, which is the nature of U.S. foreign policy during those 4 years of the Trump administration. And more specifically, we're going to proceed from the premise that Trump administration officials broke with precedent and diverged from a wide swath of foreign policy traditions over the 4 years of their administration. So that's to say, regardless of whether you liked it or didn't, there was an objective breaking with tradition. And if you looked to the foreign policy community during that time, there were often collective jaws hitting the floor from the right and left and center through many administrations as to what the Trump administration was doing. And when people were trying to understand and put some rhyme and reason to these actions, as we are wont to do, that the term that could most accurately be applied was transactionalism, which at the end of the day meant that Trump was always trying to get something specific out of each foreign policy dynamic. And typically it was more motivated by domestic political concerns and furthering his own domestic political interests than it was national security or foreign policy writ large. And that in and of itself, the extent to which domestic foreign policy concerns and the particular concerns of President Trump, the extent to which those drove foreign policy was itself a break with precedent. So today, the question is, we have a new president, one who is no stranger to DC, who's a member of the institution for many, many decades. And many people thought that this would be a return to what America was, or putting us back within the lines of what we expect from US foreign policy. However, there's also the notion that many of the things that President Trump did signal to the world certain intentions that may be hard to undo, that many times the rhetoric was a break with tradition, but the actual policies may not have been as inconsistent as many of the commentators thought. And so today, across all these different issue areas, panelists will discuss the extent to which there are opportunities for President Biden and his administration to undo or counteract or address weaknesses in Trump administration actions, where maybe there will be a lack of opportunity to address what was done during those 4 years, and where the administration will willingly further Trump administration actions. So with that, I'll hand it off to the first speaker, Professor Leeds.
Thanks so much, Zach and Pablo, and thank you for including me in this important discussion. What I'm going to talk about today links very closely to what Zach introduced. And I'm going to focus in particular on U.S. relations with its allies. And when I talk about alliances, I'm talking about formal agreements among independent states to cooperate militarily in the face of potential or realized military conflict. The U.S. is allied with most of Europe through NATO, most of Latin America through the Organization of American States, plus Australia, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Pakistan, and Thailand. And other than the expansion of NATO, these commitments, these defense pact commitments, where we're promising to defend other states if they're attacked, and in some cases, those states also promise to defend the U.S. if it's attacked. Those commitments have been relatively unchanged since the early years of the Cold War, as I said, with the exception of the expansion of NATO. Alliances are generally a response to threat. The idea is that countries work together to create a stronger military force. And the idea is that that's first going to deter conflicts. It's going to stop adversaries from challenging you. Or if you have to fight, it's going to help you win wars. Strong states like the US may offer protection to weak states because they have an interest in that weak state's security. So it could be due to shared economic interests, a desire to deny that ally to an adversary, concerns about the possible negative impact if conflict occurs in a particular state. So the idea is that the US forms alliances because it values its own security and the security of its partners. And a lot of research suggests that defense pacts do provide deterrence, that they provide credible commitments of support to potential target states, which makes it less likely that adversaries will attempt to use military force to change the status quo. So essentially, the shadow of the potential for military force affects bargaining. So we may never see anything happen a lot of the time. If alliances are successful, they should never be invoked, because what happens is adversaries never challenge their potential targets. And so it looks like nothing's happened, but we can't know what would have happened in the absence of those commitments for support. So the value of alliances isn't always obvious. In fact, they're usually working best when no one notices them at all. And so when we think about the value of alliances, I always think about a famous quote by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She was actually talking about voting rights. But to paraphrase, believing that alliances are unnecessary because interstate war has declined is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. Trump, on the other hand, publicly questioned the value of long-standing alliances to the United States. Now, there are lots of reasons why we might think alliances become less valuable and would need to end. And with 5 minutes, I'm not going to be able to go into all of those. But I can tell you it's not obvious to me that there were any international changes that changed the value of these alliances to the US. Instead, what I think changed is the nature of the domestic coalition that Trump depended on to gain power and maintain power within the US. And in particular, this was a more isolationist coalition. It was a coalition that was more in favor of economic nationalism and populism. And in part, this is because it's a coalition that had different interests than either the coalitions that supported Romney, for instance, in the prior election, so the past Republican coalition, or the Democratic coalition. One of the biggest differences between Trump voters and Romney voters is in whites without a college degree, for example. Before 2016, there was very little difference between Republicans and Democrats in education level, but in the 2016 election, Republicans were significantly less well educated. In a knowledge-based economy, education is related to opportunity. And those that are less likely to compete well economically on the global stage tend to prefer more isolationist policies. So we can see why a different kind of domestic supporting coalition might lead Trump to favor other policies and not to see the value of international engagement for the United States that previous administrations had seen. So Trump talked a lot about ending alliances or pulling back on them, but at the same time, we had a lot of other actors in the US government, Congress, for instance, showing very strong support for NATO and other US alliances. Now, the real challenge with alliances is they only work if they're credible. That basically members have to assure one another that if war occurs, they'll fulfill their commitments, and this is going to be costly. So Trump's goal, he said, was to improve bargains, to make other allies pay more, to get the US a better deal in bargaining. In order to do that, he wanted to convince US allies that the US doesn't value alliances so much anymore, that these aren't that important, that we can walk away. The problem with that, when future credibility is at stake, is that either it's completely unsuccessful in the short term because you don't succeed in breaking credibility, or it has very serious negative long-term consequences, even if the alliance is maintained. And that's because when allies start to get worried about the future credibility of the US, they may not end the alliance. The US is a really valuable partner, but they may start to hedge. They may start to think, I can't put all my eggs in this basket. I need to start thinking about other potential allies, or I need to start thinking about building my own capabilities so that I can defend myself and rely less on the US. As they do that, they become less susceptible to US positions. They become less willing to accommodate US interests. They become less willing to pay more for US support. So in the end, by making US commitments less credible, we undermine our bargaining position as allies seek other opportunities to find support and are willing to pay less for support that they think is less secure. Biden and Blinken, Secretary of State Blinken, have emphasized the high value that they place on these alliances, but I think what allies are thinking about is who comes next. Is this Trump coalition going to continue to be a factor? And do future leaders have to respond to a coalition that may see less value in US engagement in the international system and the prime seat at the bargaining table that this gives the US? So they're going to need concrete reassurance to continue to rely on the US. The Biden administration has started that. Blinken's first trips were to Tokyo, Seoul, and Brussels to meet with NATO. But it'll be interesting to think about what more it will take besides words and visits to reassure our allies so that we can maintain a premier position in these bargaining arenas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ashley. So let's move on. I mean, it's like to a related topic, which is associated with foreign economic policy stances of both the Trump and Biden administration. I'm going to ask Tyson, Professor Chatagnier, to should we expect, I mean, sharp departures between the two? What are the main characteristics, I mean, it's like of the foreign economic policy stances that we observe under Trump and the first glimpses at the Biden administration?
Okay, so thank you, Pablo, for introducing me, and thanks to all of you for coming today. So I'm gonna spend a little bit of time talking about sort of President Trump's foreign policy ideology, how that affected the policies that he put together, how President Biden sort of sees foreign policy, and how, to what extent we might see changes between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, and to what extent we might not. Right? And I think this is related in a lot of ways to sort of what we've heard already about kind of interactions abroad, willingness to kind of cooperate with others. I may be a little more skeptical, I think, about the desire to break with what we've seen so far, though, on the part of the Biden administration. But so when we think about the Trump administration, I think the watchword for the Trump administration is unilateralism. Right, this idea that the United States can and really ought to go it alone in a lot of these cases. President Trump sort of had this very explicitly sort of realist outlook, this idea of doing things that are in what he considered to be the national interest of the United States. right? And oftentimes the sort of the short-term national interest of the United States. And so this means taking actions that maybe aren't especially popular abroad, but those that the administration sees as benefiting the U.S. sort of strategically or in other ways. And so what we saw were a lot of decisions being made by the Trump administration that they believed to be in the interest of the United States, and actions that were taken kind of by the U.S. and the U.S. alone, right? And so we can think about things like the outgoing Obama administration had negotiated this trade agreement with the Pacific countries, with Asia and Oceania, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is meant to be sort of this free trade agreement between the U.S. and these countries in this region. Candidate Trump very much opposed this, right? During the 2016 election, sort of talked about why this is problematic, why it's a bad deal for the United States. And so, so as soon as he gets elected, he sort of scuttles that, right? And so, so the U.S. sort of pulls out of that. It, completely changes that agreement, which ultimately sort of another version that goes into force for the other countries that were involved. But the TPP, as negotiated, kind of goes away. So the U.S. sort of pulls out of that, and in doing so, kind of pulls out of economic engagement with that whole region of the world. Now, one of the issues with that is it kind of opens the door for others to get involved, and by others I mean China, right? And so one of the concerns is to what extent is China going to become involved with economic relations in the Pacific region? Now, they're not part of this agreement, but that always kind of raises its head. China has been kind of an area that President Trump had kind of a lot to say about. Let's say it was relations with China were always something that were on the Trump administration's mind, and so things like trade deficit with China, things like kind of Chinese economic competition with the United States. And so one of the things that we saw under the Trump administration was the imposition of tariffs, the initiation of this sort of trade war with China. And so this is kind of another situation in which the Trump administration is acting by itself to impose, sort of use U.S. economic power to try to change the actions of another country, right? And so by initiating these taxes on imports and exports, what the Trump administration is trying to do here is trying to kind of, again, get these better deals for the United States out of China, or what they perceive to be better deals out of China. We saw the U.S. acting alone, kind of in terms of sanctions with Iran, where the U.S. pulled out of the comprehensive agreement on sanctions. I'm not going to talk about sort of the nuclear aspect of that, but the economic aspect here, right? The U.S. is kind of using its leverage again to try to change this behavior. So the Trump administration is worried that Iran is cheating there, and so what they want to do is kind of use this U.S. power in that instance. The Biden administration kind of has a very different perspective, right? So the Biden administration, sort of multilateralism has been important. This idea of, President Biden uses this phrase, America's back, and really supposed to signal to the rest of the world, hey, the U.S. wants to engage once again. The U.S. wants to sort of involve itself with others. And we saw kind of with the coup in Myanmar, when the Biden administration started talking about sanctions, one of the things that President Biden comes out and explicitly says is, we will be working with our partners on this, right? And so there's this idea of bringing others in, of working with other countries in accomplishing these goals, right? So the Biden administration is still about sort of pursuing American interests, but maybe kind of thinking about communal interests as well, right? And also thinking about how we can bring others in to pursue these interests. So the rhetoric coming out of the Biden administration is very, very different, right? Certainly much more, there's at least a veneer of multilateralism here, this idea of cooperation. Now the question is, to what extent does this translate to policy, right? So I've already talked about sort of the Trump administration policy. What does the Biden administration policy look like so far, and what can we expect from it? And ultimately, when we look at what we've seen thus far and kind of the indications of what we can expect to see in the near future, there's not a lot of change here, despite the fact that that the Biden administration talks about kind of a different perspective, a different way of understanding international relations. The things that the Trump administration has done are not being reversed in this area, at least, right? So we haven't seen an end to the trade war with China. We've in fact seen, to some extent, a little more kind of escalation in some of these areas. We are not seeing kind of the U.S. moving back into engagement with sort of like the CPA TPP, the successor to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We are not seeing, we haven't seen the U.S. get back involved with kind of a sanctions deal. There are steps toward it. That's certainly true. They're trying to make steps toward it, The question is how sincere are they about that, right? And so, so we haven't seen a lot of change, and a lot of I think is related to the way that the Biden administration sort of views the purpose of foreign policy, this idea of foreign policy for middle class. I can talk more about that later. But what we've seen so far suggests that if you like the Trump administration foreign economic policy, you're going to like the Biden administration foreign economic policy. If you like the policy but you didn't like the rhetoric, you're going to like the Biden administration foreign policy even more. If you didn't like President Trump's foreign economic policy, you're probably not going to be too happy with the Biden administration. So that's kind of the way I see things going right now. Again, happy to talk more about this later.
Okay, let's move on to Professor Shea. Patrick, I understand that you are interested in talking about the main security challenges that the Biden administration is facing. And some of those come, as a consequence of Trump's decisions, during his tenure. So, what you see, the biggest challenges might be with respect to the Middle East, Asia, or even Eastern Europe and Russia.
Thank you, Pablo, and thank you for including me in this this great panel. So I would agree with what Ashley Leeds said, is that in 3 months the security situation in the world really hasn't changed, and whether that's because of inertia or the pandemic, I'm not sure, but the security policies have changed, and we see a mixture of both withdrawal and engagement on the security fronts. Withdrawal, we see the US is leaving Afghanistan, which actually is consistent with what Trump wanted to do, but maybe clumsily planned for it. But we also see withdrawal from Yemen, which is sort of in direct conflict with what our, our security partner, Saudi Arabia, would want us to do. So, so we already see some breaks with with the Trump administration, but you also see some engagement, and this is engagement that Tyson was talking about on the economic front, but also reassuring security partners, sort of what Ashley was finished with in terms of reassuring that the United States is going to be there, not only in the Biden administration, but in future administrations as well. And so you see, arms sales to Ukraine and Taiwan at very strategic timing, where you see mobilization on the Ukrainian front or Ukrainian border. You see overtures of China maybe thinking about making passes at Taiwan, and the Biden administration quickly responded to that with very clear signals, not just words, but clear increases in military capabilities. But you also see re-engagement on the Iranian front, which Tyson already alluded to. So trying to get the Iranian nuclear deal back into place, but that's in conflict with what Israel wants. And so you see this again, sort of some of the issues we saw during the Obama administration in terms of tensions between the Obama administration and Saudi Arabia, or the Obama administration and Israel, are coming up. And some of those, those relationships actually were smoother under the Trump administration. So while the Trump administration created some challenges for the Biden administration and future administrations, there is also some issues that are, I think, are going to be more difficult for the United States to handle, given sort of strains with some of our security partners. And so it'll be interesting to see how the United States deals with this. But what is clear, though, is the United States has its focus on what China and what Russia is doing, and that seems to be pretty consistent from the Biden administration so far.
Thanks, Patrick. Next, we have Ryan Kennedy speaking about energy, the environment, as they apply particularly to climate change?
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Pablo, for organizing all this. So one area that we've seen a very large, pretty significant change in terms of approach has been in environment and energy between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. And I'm going to particularly talk about climate change because that's the one that's most relevant to the foreign policy aspects that we are discussing in this forum. And so I prepared a couple of just kind of illustrations here. One of the classic problems, of course, with climate change is that it's really an issue to where no single country can completely solve the problem by itself. It's a global problem. It's something where all countries are going to have to, in some ways, work together in order to do this. And there's a real question about how do you allocate responsibility? How do you get all these different actors to work together towards a common goal in something which they're not going to be equally affected by? The changes that are going to come about because of climate change are going to predominantly affect people who are in the poorest countries, who are in the most vulnerable countries, and yet these are not the areas that are the largest contributors to climate change. And the US is particularly important for this process for a few different reasons. One is just in terms of the total amount of contribution that the United States contributes to greenhouse gases. So the United States is the second highest greenhouse gas emitter behind China. As you can see, China currently emits about 28%, the United States 15%. But the United States is also one of the highest per capita contributors to climate change. So per person, the United States ranks fourth behind Saudi Arabia, Kazakhstan, and Australia, while China ranks all the way down at 13th. In other words, the United States is both high in terms of total emissions and in terms of the amount of emissions per individual. Not only that, but we are the highest emitter by far of the developed countries. The second highest developed country in terms of contribution is Japan at about 3% of the global total. So when it comes to countries, to developed countries' contribution, the United States is particularly critical. A third thing is that the United States has historically also been quite critical to this. And I'm going to put this just kind of playing a background. So greenhouse gases are cumulative, especially carbon dioxide, because it stays in the atmosphere for an extensive period of time. And the United States is, by a pretty wide margin, the largest contributor to greenhouse gases over the last 50 years and even over the last 100+ years. So our cumulative impact has been especially high. So it's very difficult to get any kind of international action without getting the United States actively aboard. And the Trump administration's attitude towards this, with its withdrawal from the Paris Climate Treaty late last year, as well as a number of other actions in terms of weakening the amount of carbon reductions under the Clean Air Act, all these things managed to drastically reduce it. So just yesterday, the Biden administration announced as part of the White House's Earth Day Summit that it was going to reduce emissions by 52% over 2005 benchmark by 2030. Now, this goal is not as ambitious as it first sounds. The United States is already down over our 2005 benchmark. This is not as large of a change when you take into account the benchmarks that were already set under the United States' previous agreements. And also, of course, you have to realize that under the Paris Climate Agreement, all of these kinds of standards are voluntary by the countries. Each country sets its own standard for how much it wants to contribute. There's an additional issue that the Biden administration faces with this, which is that the global community is a little bit more, how do I say, hesitant to trust U.S. leadership on this particular area at this point, because at this point, as the Chinese delegation pointed out during these discussions, it seems like the United States can simply enter or exit at a a pretty rapid pace. And not only that, but many of the changes that would need to take place are going to require not just executive action on the part of the Biden administration, but also legislative action. So while the global community has seen this as encouraging, there's still a long way to go to establish any kind of trust or reputation for the United States in terms of leadership on the climate change issue. Something that's going to be very difficult to establish without some kind of help from Congress, which of course is always a dicey thing to rely on. So I am going to go ahead and I'm going to leave it there, but of course, happy to discuss further as we get into the conversation.
Okay, thanks very much, Ryan. Now we're going to turn to Niki Marinov, who's going to discuss human rights, in particular, as they pertain to China and Russia, as well as the Armenian genocide and Saudi Arabia.
Thank you. Thank you so much. As our distinguished panelists and listeners may know, the United States has for a while appointed itself as a kind of a global leader of human rights. And that's has been going on at least since World War II, but has always been a somewhat ambiguous commitment in terms of, on the one hand, the United States promotes a set of human rights that it deems are global and apply globally. On the other hand, the United States kind of shuns away from global movements to promote human rights. So treaties, etc., we don't like them. We're a little bit suspicious towards them. So there has been this kind of conflict at the heart of U.S. human rights policy for a while. It's definitely was there under Trump and is there under Biden and will continue to be there. So the rest of the world has always looked at American human rights promotion with at least a degree of suspicion, if not outright rejection and hostility, though some do welcome it for sure. And this human rights promotion has always been characterized by at least two conflicts. And one is between the kind of the president and Congress. And the president always wants to promote a kind of, to have a freer reign to really promote alliances over human rights and not trigger any seismic shocks in alliances by criticizing people such as the Saudis and many others who are unsavory but ostensibly needed allies for the United States. And the other conflict is between the parties, with the Republican Party traditionally promoting a more a version of international human rights that's more consistent with its domestic ideology, which would call for things such as barring assistance to countries that perhaps allow abortions or other things that the Republican Party does not like. So those twin conflicts have been going on in U.S. Human rights foreign policy for a while, and there has been a lot of continuity with these themes under Trump and under Biden, right? So one of the things that Trump definitely did to human rights was he elevated this religious element, reproductive rights element. He, in fact, Pompeo tried to lead a kind of almost like a crusade type of thing, agreement on this by organizing countries to promote it. The effort didn't entirely succeed, but was definitely viewed by U.S. allies, the Western Europeans, etc., with a lot of suspicion. That probably will not continue under Biden. Biden, obviously, it comes from a different party and therefore is not especially keen on promoting this particular agenda. But nor will multilateralism and human rights experience some sort of a resurgence. Biden has made no commitment to anything that smacks of multilateralism in anything, as far as I can tell, other than the environment, where it seems like the United States will take a lead, as Professor Kennedy kind of flagged, but not on human rights. And if you look at some of the other changes that will probably happen is the Trump administration created a perception which was somewhat matched by a loose perception that it's aligned with the authoritarians of the world. The sort of the alt-right, we like Orban, we like Putin, we like the Chinese president. and that was very damaging to human rights at the level of perceptions. Not that the United States did that much to help those guys, but somehow for the United States to be aligned with those people, and for members of the administration to go to Hungary and ally themselves with the pretty odious governing party in that state, that has provided plenty of bad optics, right? Which has been damaging from the point of view of many people. Now, the Biden administration is sending a clear signal of change in some respect. In this sense, some of the people that the former administration hated were the Open Society Fund and Human Rights Watch, and we have the current leader of the Open Society is being now considered for a leading post in the State Department to in fact lead to be undersecretary and to be a global ambassador for human rights for the United States. So that is a kind of a pretty clear ostensible change in terms of priorities, the kinds of things that the Open Society fights for, which are much more consistent with the global fight for human rights as understood by most countries in the world, will be on the agenda for sure. Whether or not the kinds of treaties that the United States has been a little bit apprehensive about will therefore play more of a role in US policy, we'll have to see. But that certainly is a kind of an interesting development. Some other developments that are perhaps interesting, perhaps tomorrow, for the first time, an American president will utter the word genocide when referring to the mass extermination of Armenians in Turkey. That is a significant shift, even though genocide has been used by US policymakers. By the Senate passed such a non-binding resolution last year. Turkey is extremely sensitive on this issue. It sends people to jail. It's a very big word in Turkey. There will probably be some repercussions to this. So that's a bit of a change. Other things such as refugees and how we think about refugees, not much of a change, right? That we have kind of seen that. Another interesting change will be with respect to Russia, though again, we'll have to see to what extent. Russia has been, some of these election interventions that occurred in the past US elections, they started as a result of US democracy promotion and the US being perceived by Putin as others as kind of like trying to put its people in power elsewhere by promoting democracy. So other regimes failed to see any difference between the principal promotion of democracy, of which the United States does some, and they fail to distinguish that from a plain intervention in their own affairs, in part because they cannot conceive of democracy promotion as such in their own foreign policy. And obviously, Biden will now has spoken harshly against Putin, has called him a murderer, which may help account for the mobilization around Ukraine. However, will much come out of this? Will really much change with respect to Russia? I'm really not sure. For example, there's no real talk about a commission to examine election interventions, to actually do something to penalize Russia for what it has done in the past. And speaking pragmatically, when it comes to Syria, Ukraine, there simply isn't that much space for the Biden administration to alienate Putin. In the end of the day, they will need Putin, just as they will need Saudi Arabia, right? And Saudi Arabia, which recently was the ruling family there was implicated in the brutal murder of a journalist on US who was working in the US. He was killed in Turkey, Khashoggi. The Saudis are pretty much escaping scot-free, and Biden has made that official. So some changes, not so many changes. China, interestingly, the Trump administration tariff crusade against them was also kind of peppered with the human rights rhetoric, which oddly enough gave a lot of people to a lot of hope to people such as people in Hong Kong, right? That mostly was not really met as a kind of not much happened to people who abused rights in Hong Kong, even though there was some sanctions, right, at least symbolic sanctions against Chinese officials. Biden has claimed that there'll be a price to be paid by the Chinese leadership. Again, not particularly likely other than rhetorically. And so if you, as Professor Chatagnier mentioned earlier, if you like rhetoric, you will like the Biden approach a bit more here and there. But that's about it, probably. One of the probably most promising developments, and I'll close with that, for the United States and is this notion of soft power in leading in human rights. The BLM protests that led to a conviction in Minneapolis have sent powerful shockwaves through the world and in places far. And this is something that lately the human rights agenda has morphed into a kind of a leaderless campaign, aided by social media, by movements, by protests. And there, the United States, with its millions of citizens who take to the streets with Twitter, with social media, etc., is an absolute leader. And that has created a lot of positive momentum for the United States, and probably much change will come from this, more than it would come at the official level from the Biden administration. This is it from me for now.
Niki, while we have you, there's a question from an attendee about the if we find any implication of U.S. condemning China's camps killing Myanmar Muslims, and probably also, I mean, talking about the Uyghurs. Do you see any movement in that area? I mean, it's like the past summit between China and the U.S. was not very friendly, and some of the elements that arose there suggest that these issues might be manipulated. So what's the end game there? What is Biden trying to achieve by bringing those issues to the fore?
Well, Biden is clearly catering to his base, and Democrats are really kind of up in arms about a lot of things that have happened, particularly to the Uyghurs and the concentration camps that there's plenty of evidence that China is running there. However, his maneuvering, the actual sort of bargaining power that he has will probably be severely limited in terms of we need China. And it's kind of unclear that the Chinese will give any ground on this. They haven't in the past. They're extremely likely to do so now. What is, to me, kind of equally worrisome is that China has started to assert its leadership in its negative leadership, let's call it that way, around the world. US citizens have been threatened for speaking out against this, and no one has come to their defense, and people have had to retract statements, etc. And again, there is no movement in the United States by Biden or anyone to really try to think about the kind of the freezing, the chilling aspect of freedom of speech that this Chinese prowess that far outstrips anything that the Russians have ever done is doing to the freedom of debate in the West. There is zero, as far as I have seen. We may yet see something to that effect, but that would worry me even more than what Biden is achieving at these summits.
Let me go back to Ashley, to Professor Leeds. So you talked about the reputational cost of walking away from our allies and alliances, both bilateral and multilateral. And so that reputational cost might take a while to rebuild. But if you were to look at one of the areas where you think that re-engaging our allies might have an impact in global affairs, which one would that be? And what would that re-engagement look like? And what impact it may have on the U.S. reputation as coming back as part of this international community?
So I think that the rhetoric, the visiting and all in this particular case, where what we're talking about is expectations about the future, matters to some extent. I think showing that the US is willing to take into account others' preferences and positions in developing foreign policy will go some way toward that. But I think that the fear is what happens if future leaders come to power who don't follow those kinds of policies. And so that's where I think things that Professor Shea was talking about, like arms sales, like maintaining troops, like sharing technology, things like that make a big difference to show that the US is still engaged in, with the world and sees itself as cooperating and sharing goals with other states. I think that, one of the things we're seeing in a place like Ukraine is it's much easier to prevent a crisis than to solve it after it starts. And so to deter Russia, for example, from using military force against, for instance, NATO members like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, is a lot easier than solving the problem after a crisis has already begun, when people have to back off of policies that they've already engaged in. It becomes much more challenging. Ukraine, of course, is not a NATO member. There have been discussions over time about whether Ukraine should be a NATO member, but it's not at this point. So there is no alliance commitment to defend Ukraine. At the same time, I think that people are looking at US resolve, and many people believe that some of the conflict we're seeing is a test of Biden, right? Both in Ukraine and in China, to think about how willing the US still is to engage internationally in the protection of current norms, practices, and other states.
Okay, thanks very much, Ashley. So turning for a moment to Dr. Kennedy, as I scan the panelists, it seems to be the general consensus is we'll see a big change in rhetoric, not a heck of a lot of change on the ground, other than what Professor Leeds was saying and what Professor Shea was saying. But we have just recently seen this very tangible, at least symbolic move by the Biden administration with respect to climate change. And Professor Kennedy, you laid out why perhaps it's not as revolutionary or large a step as it was trumpeted, but even to the extent that it represents some forward movement, we haven't discussed the elephant in the room, the GOP in Congress. So to what extent can we expect that even if there is a desire to back up that change in rhetoric with actual policy movement, that the administration can maneuver it through Congress to have that change occur?
Yeah, sure. This is really a difficult part of it. It's been a difficult part for US climate policy for an extensive period of time, going all the way back to 1997, when Congress refused to ratify the Kyoto Protocol under then President Clinton. This is, we're already actually seeing this. So a big part of meeting these climate goals is actually embodied in things like, for example, the infrastructure plan that Biden has submitted to Congress. And we've seen that this has fallen out primarily along partisan lines. There's a very narrow majority, the narrowest possible majority in the Senate for the Democrats to support Biden. There's been some talk that they may try to do a second budget reconciliation. The parliamentarian has agreed to that in order to get that infrastructure bill through. But it's not going to be an easy path to get these things done. He has some leeway. In 2007, the US Supreme Court ruled that greenhouse gases could be considered pollutants under the Clean Air and Water Act. This is what opened the door for then President Obama to try to institute through executive action much broader regulations of coal-fired power plants and things like that. But it's going to be difficult to get the really ambitious things done, the really transformative things done in terms of changing the way that US infrastructure is set up that would allow the US to make the large-scale shift from fossil fuels to to fuels that are less polluting, or to establish the kind of spending that would be necessary to research and bring about large-scale carbon capture. So yeah, a lot of it depends on Congress. A lot of it depends what happens in another year in 2022, when the Senate comes up for election and that barest of bare majority, likelier than not, becomes a Republican majority.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to kind of dovetail from that and go to Professor Shea and ask roughly the same question. So on those issues where you were speaking, when we have the 50-50 split in the Senate, how do you think the Biden administration will be able to maneuver through that to make any forward progress, or do you think they won't be able to?
I guess what should become evident through this discussion is there's a lot of issues that the United States deals with, right? But the United States has a varied toolbox, right? It has its alliances, but it has, military aid, development aid, arms transfers, and so on, right? But some of those tools do require the buy-in from Congress, right? In order for them to be effective. You can't just use the military for every single problem, because the military is a blunt tool, and it becomes less effective the farther we use it away from home base. So there is going to be some issues, and so the idea of solving the issues with China requires not only sort of military policy, but also an economic policy and an environmental policy, which require different tools, and different actors in the United States have different interests on cooperation and competition. So in the current domestic political environment in the United States, there's really not a lot of reason to be optimistic. But there are some things that that Biden can do on his own, and you've seen some of those already. Those signals of support to key partners abroad is where we're seeing sort of I guess you can call that as sort of the easy fruit to pick. I think the harder harvest is coming down the road, which is going to require some buy-in from Congress. But this also, varies by issue. So on Iran, it's going to be really hard to get any GOP support. On China, I think there's a lot more room for engagement, because I think there is, again, continuance from the Trump administration. So I guess, that's a vague answer, but it's more of a wait and see.
So this connects, thank you so much, Patrick. This connects to a question from the audience about TPP, which is pretty, much there, but it was replaced in the Pacific by the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is a mouthful to say. And it's interesting because the question is related to what Patrick just said, and I want to ask Tyson's reactions on this. The idea that dealing with China does not only require, a security response, but may also need some form of economic engagement, or engagement to prevent China from being so influential. So, what's your reaction there? Do you see? You talked a lot about continuity, Tyson. Do you see a big possibility for departure and opportunity for changing the relationship in the Pacific region?
Yeah. So one of the when President Trump sort of talked about scuttling the TPP at the time, one of the things that a lot of folks who are involved in foreign policy were worried about is this opens the door to China, right? That if the U.S. isn't going to be leading in the Pacific region economically, it sort of opens the door for China to step in and say, well, we're gonna do this. And if China is able to kind of take a sort of an economic leadership role, then some of the kind of aggression that we've seen from it isn't quite as necessary anymore, because it can sort of get the things that it needs through other means, right? I think that kind of the rhetoric from the Biden administration suggests that they are looking to get more engaged in things, right? So they do want more multilateral involvement. They do want to assume kind of this leadership role that the Trump administration kind of want to pull out of. But there's kind of another element to this, and I think this has a lot to do with what Professor Leeds was saying about kind of electoral coalitions. So the 2016 election just sort of changes a lot about the way that Americans think about trade and about economic interactions. And so, of course, we saw on President Trump's side kind of this kind of right-wing populism that was very skeptical of trade, very skeptical of international agreements, of sort of bad deals. We saw it on the left as well, right? And so with Senator Sanders kind of running for president, he emphasized a lot of the same kinds of things that President Trump did. And President Biden has put forth this idea of what he calls foreign policy for the middle class. And I saw there was an article in the Financial Times about a month ago that referred to this as Trumpism with a human face. And so the idea here is a lot of what President Biden is kind of talking about here is basically the same thing that President Trump was saying, just dressed up to look a little better to sort of polite company, right? To people in the foreign policy establishment. And so I don't see the Biden administration joining the TPA-CPP, the CPA-TPP, anytime soon. I don't see the Biden administration sort of reversing Trumpian withdrawal from some of these economic agreements. I do think that if sort of opportunities arise to kind of negotiate new agreements, the Biden administration will be a little more open to it. But my concern is we moved past kind of the consensus that we had up through the Obama administration, and that included Republican presidents as well, of kind of this openness to trade, and we're moving more in this direction of sort of more closed offness. And I think it's going to be politically difficult for President Biden to sort of reverse what President Trump has done.
Let me take another question from the audience and saying it's posed in the following terms. I mean, it's like consider this continuity. Is there anything you find of value of the Trump way or the Trump method? I mean, it's like a foreign policy engagement.
Is this directed at me or kind of?
Yeah, I mean, like, or whoever wants to take it. I mean, you were talking, so I went back to you.
Sure. I mean, so it's certainly the case that the Trumpian kind of America first approach, which is kind of centered around American interests. There's something to be said about that. From an American perspective, something to be said about that. I think part of the problem with it is it was defined a little too narrowly, perhaps, and a little too short term, right? And so it's not necessarily the problem that that President Trump wanted to get good deals out of these interactions. The problem is, what is it that we want out of this, right? What would a good deal look like? And the way I think that the Trump administration was defining a good deal was maybe not the same way that Americans would. Now, I do think that that kind of the idea of foreign policy working for everyone in the country and not just the elites, not just kind of members of the foreign policy establishment, that's not a bad thing, right? So sort of the rhetoric that's coming out of the Biden administration isn't bad. And I think to some extent, the way that the Trump administration conceptualized things was not necessarily bad. The problem is, again, the way that we're defining things that are good for the middle class or good for American interests. These maybe are kind of thought of on a surface level, and there's not enough kind of digging down to see, well, what would be a good deal in the long run for Americans in the middle class or elsewhere.
Okay, I'd like to jump in and I think ask a question. Excuse me. I'd like to ask a question posed in the Q&A by Professor Shore, which to my mind may be the silent answer to a lot of these questions where Tyson, you were just going through all the consistencies, and it does seem after a while a bit quizzical as to why there isn't more divergence between the two administrations. And that question is, while we see the far left, the neo-progressives, the squad, if you want to call them that, and Bernie and Warren, while we see them talking a lot about things they want this administration to do domestically, do we see them making the same demands internationally in terms of foreign policy? And I think the answer is no, right? And I think that perhaps I'd like to throw it out to all of you. From what I've seen, it's because the polling shows that far left and the far right Trump folks are isolationist. Like they don't really care right now, and the left doesn't really want to commit too much attention and resources in terms of political capital and financial resources to foreign policy that may take funds and attention away from their domestic priorities. So what do you guys think about that? That maybe one reason why we're not seeing as much consistency is that the domestic political realities that the Biden administration faces from the left are interestingly not that different than what Trump was facing on the right.
So I'd like to take a quick stab on this to completely agree with what you just said, and also just reinforce it with one observation, and maybe it has struck others. In the first televised address that Biden made on the pandemic, it was a kind of a big deal where he announced that vaccinations will be forthcoming, etc. It was a few weeks ago. There wasn't a single word, and I mean a single word, that brought in the outside world. So he was like, we have vaccines, everybody's gonna get it. The outside world, allies, were not mentioned. Like there wasn't a single word, and that really struck me. I did expect him to at least utter a sentence. And so in this hour of need, when our allies are like really struggling, the idea that the US administration would not even mention this was really, to me, was mind-blowing.
We have a number of questions about how the US will or should re-engage Iran and the role of Iran in the Middle East, including a question about how can the US and the Biden administration go back to the agreements that were scuttled by Trump without forcing Iran first, it's like to comply. It's like, and whether that pressure on compliance, it's like having the US not comply in the first place may make things difficult for that agreement to go back in place.
I can address that. I mean, this goes into issues that were discussed by Dr. Leeds, in the sense that they can strike a deal right now. You can just print out the last deal. The issue is what's going to happen in 3 years or in 7 years after a new election. Does everything just go back and they tear it up again? So it's this there's distrust on both sides. Can the United States actually keep a promise based on leadership turnover? And can Iran keep a promise of non-enriching uranium? And it took a long time for the two sides to reach that trust, to sign the agreement. And then obviously the United States backed away from that agreement. And there's no reason to believe that anything's really changed domestically in the United States, that the next GOP leader isn't going to just back away. So it's going to be really hard to reach a reinforcing agreement on that front.
Just to piggyback on that, I think one of the things that's often missing from the American conversation on Iran is Iranian domestic politics. And it was about the most moderate segment of the potential leadership that we were dealing with to get the last deal through. And they had egg on their face when the next administration, US administration, came in and pulled back. So the domestic political constraints of the moderates to push back against the hardliners in Iran are pretty strong this time. And we're probably going to need to give them more than we're willing to get them back to the table due to their own domestic politics.
So let's continue this conversation in terms of do we expect any important domestic political developments to impact the U.S.'s reputation abroad. I mean, it's like, so there's a question from the audience, and it was addressed to Professor Marinov in terms of whether the U.S. has any credibility pushing for a human rights and democratization agenda, given, I mean, it's like how democratic practices, I mean, it's like are being curtailed, I mean, it's like at least at the state level in terms of participation and suppression of voters and the like, and also the events on January 6th that may have an impact on the stability and credibility of American democratic institutions.
I think so. I think that even simply by not being Trump, by not sending out this message of sort of like, I adore the North Korean leader and Orban is great, etc. Even in that respect, just by kind of not radiating this this really pernicious kind of aura, the United States is already kind of making a difference, or leading, or this change is making a difference. Like I spoke earlier, the fact that the United States leads through what it does, what people on the street do, that's also enormously powerful. I wouldn't expect the leadership to occur in formal treaties where the United States takes the lead globally, etc. But certainly, given that a lot of the progressive agenda domestically that has been empowered is unfolding, given that this will continue to kind of make its round domestically, it will reverberate around the world a lot. Now, detractors of the United States have always, people who don't like the United States, they have always used the problems of the United States as some kind of a rhetorical foil to say that the United States is not entitled to have this conversation. But that's a constant, and that's not really serious. Many people, including in Russia, don't believe this anyway. This is something the dictators kind of throw around, and it's just political talk.
So I'd like to connect this, Ryan, to something you mentioned before. I mean, it's like in terms of contributions to current climate change. I mean, Biden has made bold statements, but as you showed us in your presentation, the U.S. has a long way to go, and the U.S. is one of the main contributors, I mean, to greenhouse gas emissions. So, do you think that this domestic agenda for renewables and carbon capture and carbon neutral or carbon negative policies may provide some form of reassurance to other foreign powers to try to engage the U.S. internationally in an effort to curb emissions and lead to a lower carbon future?
So the short answer is yes. I mean, what we've generally seen is that U.S. leadership in international environmental issues is, if not decisive, is essential, right? Especially when it comes to climate change issues. And there are a few different reasons for this, right? So like, I guess to put it in more formal terms, it's not sufficient, but it's certainly necessary. And there are a few different ways in which this is the case. The first one is that it's really difficult to have any kind of credible discussion of climate change where the US is not playing an active role for all the reasons that I mentioned before. The second is that in order to take action on climate change, we also have to do something to curb the rapid growth of greenhouse gases in less developed countries. China has already surpassed other countries in terms of, and as you saw from that chart, has been growing rapidly in terms of its greenhouse gas emissions. That curve has to bend at a faster rate than it is currently. India has a huge amount of coal production that has already been approved and is, going through books. That has to be changed. Rapidly growing economies in Africa are certainly going to increase their greenhouse gas emissions. And so it's going to take a concerted effort on the part of developed Western countries, not only to clean up their own acts domestically, but also to provide the incentives to other countries to also, allow development of their energy sectors that are in a way that is not heavily polluting. And I just don't see how that kind of agreement or investment occurs without the United States being at the table and actively contributing to those efforts. So yeah, I don't think that US involvement is sufficient. And now that we're back to the table, everything is solved. But I do think that it's absolutely a necessary step if we're to have any hope at all of reaching or even approximating climate goals within the time frame that we need to do so.
So actually, there's a question in the Q&A for you about the Biden emphasis on multilateralism and going back to alliances, and what's the main driver of this? Is it just recognition of external challenges and they need to engage? Is it driven by domestic politics? Or is it just a signal that we're breaking with the Trump agenda? And if so, should we expect that, as Patrick mentioned early on, might die with the next administration?
So I think broadly, commenting on a lot of this discussion, there's a lot of emphasis on the fact that Biden, and of course it's only been a few months, hasn't substantively done a lot of things different than Trump, with some areas of exception, clearly. And what I would suggest is that's also because substantively, Trump couldn't do a lot of the things that he wanted to do, right? So the change from Obama to Trump was much more rhetorical than in action, just as the change from Trump to Biden is much more rhetorical than in action. And this is because it's very hard to change democratic foreign policy, and particularly in the US. There are a lot of actors that are involved, a lot of compromises that have to be made, both domestically and internationally. And so I do think that new domestic coalitions lead to some changes in policies. I'm not suggesting that there's nothing there, but I also think that there's some tensions between groups in the US that keep policy from changing in both directions. And I think that some of what we're seeing in both ways are different ways of responding to new and in a new international environment. So I think, for instance, we've talked about trade being one of the areas where there was probably the most change from Obama to Trump, or at least one of the areas where there was a lot of change. But we need to remember that Hillary Clinton was also said she was not in favor of the TPP, right? And so there have been broad changes in that. When we think about alliance politics, I think that the world that Biden is facing does look more challenging than previous worlds. I think the rise of China is very real to to people in the US. I think that the way that the Biden administration is approaching that is to talk a lot about norms and about rules of the international system, and to make this about maintaining a liberal international order, whereas Trump made it more a US-China competition. Biden is trying to make this a liberal international order competition versus China and Russia. And so I think that's an area where Biden is drawing alliances to counter what he sees as a threat. That being said, I also think that if you're predicting that that the new alliance politics are really about the China threat, you would not predict a lot of movement toward NATO, right? You'd predict a lot of movement toward Japan and Korea and forming alliances in Asia. And while I think that Biden is clearly strengthening those, there's still a lot of emphasis on Europe and sort of this, again, enhancing this liberal international order. So I think in the end, we need to think about what we expect in terms of the degree of foreign policy change to Trump and Biden in the context of how much we can expect any dramatic foreign policy change. And also that, yes, international changes are happening that require responses. And so it's not all driven by domestic politics. It's not all driven by a movement back to the past. It's also driven by the new challenges that the administration sees itself facing.
Thanks, Ashley. So there are a couple questions raised by the audience that roughly go to this issue of soft power. One of them gets at US assisting India with COVID-19 relief. Another one points to the Belt and Road Initiative by China as a soft power tool. And then as I was just listening to Professor Leeds describe the actual differences between the two administrations, one thing you said was how the two are framing these roughly the same bargaining practices. And I think that myself included, the panelists have today sort of treated this dichotomy between rhetoric and action with an implicit judgment that rhetoric doesn't mean much, and it's actual action that we're worried about. So, you know, we all have been adhering to this hard power, soft power schism. But for a moment, if we look at those two issue areas, or if we look to our general conversation about the divergence in rhetoric, what do the panelists think about the significance of that change in rhetoric? And to what extent are these change in frames and perhaps some low level issues that the Biden administration is changing from the Trump administration, to what extent will these have significant impacts on international security issues? The folks who pivoted toward security can answer that, or anyone really. Significance of soft power writ large.
I could take the first stab of this. I mean, there's different types of rhetoric. There's rhetoric that says I'm going to do something, but and able to actually do that requires a governmental process that no one can guarantee. But there's also statements of just we will support you in X, Y, and Z conditions, which really clarify the conditions under which some of these security agreements and expectations are supposed to work. And those help. I think those types of statements, you know, both theoretically and empirically have shown to actually have some effects on adversaries and allies' expectations of actions. But the rhetoric surrounding policy is in terms of actually governmental processes is different and could be construed as cheap talk.
I think it matters what the rhetoric is. I think that, you know, when we're talking about the US is currently the leader in the international system, and what kind of international system the US is wants to support matters a lot to others who are deciding whether to support that system, right? And so when you say what I care about is America first, and what I care about is America making a lot of money, that doesn't encourage a lot of others to think that their interests are aligned with yours. On the other hand, when you approach those same issues saying, what I care about is enforcing norms and rules in the international system that protect all of us. Now, the fact is, a lot of the norms and rules in the international system disproportionately benefit states like the United States, right? And yet, at the same time, a lot of people and countries believe they have real interests in stability in the international system that's enforced by those norms and rules. And so talking about Russia and China's actions as threatening the legal basis, the normative basis of the world is much more likely, in my opinion, to gain adherence and support for the diplomatic actions of the US than an approach that says, you know, the US is the greatest country in the world and everything should belong to the US.
So one of the areas where Trump broke with traditional Republican positions was trade. And it's like, so that's an area where, as Ashley mentioned earlier, the Democrats tended to be the party of protectionism, and the Republicans tended to be the party of free trade. I mean, it's like with some caveats in different areas and so on. And one of the comments about TPP that was made by the panel reminds me of an anecdote where when President Obama was campaigning in 2008 in the Midwest and bashing NAFTA while sending his economic advisee to Canada to reassure the Canadians that this was just pandering, and it's like that eventually the US will, and it's like remain open to trade and open to business. Now, we did see recently during the Trump administration, these tariff wars with China had a very negative impact on, especially on value chains. And it's like, and so it might be interesting to understand. And it's like, what position does Biden face with respect to trade? And it's like whether or not, I mean, he'd be able to walk back. And it's like those clashes with China in terms of issues of raising the tariff to forcing openness for American goods and services in the Chinese markets, and what are the domestic political constraints for him to go back to the table and eliminate some of the sources of that dispute.
So I think there are, when we think about kind of the Biden administration policies, okay, so there are kind of a few things going on here. And I think, so what Professor Leeds brought up just a little while ago about Hillary Clinton being opposed to TPP is absolutely true. Although that was also a change in her previous stance, right? She had once called it the gold standard for these agreements, right? But she was sort of driven to kind of taking this opposition because of the way that the Democratic primary shaped up during 2016. So like, this is again, these domestic coalitions that are forming and changing the way that they think about things. And so both on the left and the right, there's kind of this strong wave of populism that we see in 2016 that's opposed to the traditional view of trade. And these, like the fact that President Trump is not in power anymore doesn't mean these coalitions have gone away, right? And so these kind of perspectives on how things should be done and who should benefit in what way from policy are still there. And I think that makes it really difficult for President Biden to kind of, even though I think, if you look at his record over, because he's been in politics for, decades now, you look at his record over these several decades, it's been pretty conventional in terms of, the way that we view things like trade. And so you would think that kind of coming in, he would want to kind of move back to sort of the Obama style foreign economic policy. I think he's constrained to some degree, and this also goes back, I think, to the question we had about sort of the progressive left, also kind of their role in this. And while they're not saying a lot about foreign policy, they have kind of already shaped that to some degree, right? And they already have these constraints that have locked the Biden administration in some of these ways to kind of taking certain stances and not taking other stances, right? And so I think kind of the way that domestic politics are going now makes it difficult to sort of shift things back the way that they were before.
Okay, I think we are running out of time. I mean, we had lots of interventions from the attendees. I mean, excellent questions for the panel, fabulous presentations. I want to thank Professors Kennedy, Marinov, Chatagnier, Leeds, Shea, and Zwald on behalf of the Center for Public Policy and the Harvard School of Public Affairs. Thank you all for joining us. I will yield to my colleague, Zach Zwald, and it's like on behalf of the Center of International and Comparative Studies to have closing remarks. And we really appreciate your time and your fabulous contributions to this conversation.
Thanks, Pablo. Yeah, I support everything Professor Pinto just said. Thank you everyone for turning out on a Friday afternoon to discuss this. I'm not exactly sure what the score is at the end of all of this. Whether we think that there's much change or isn't going to be much change, and whether we think that that's a good thing or a bad thing. So once again, I appreciate the panelists' effort and the turnout. I'm really impressed by it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for organizing.